My name is Dr. Kate McCarthy, and on behalf of Dr. Una Keeley and Hugh Murphy and myself, I am delighted to welcome you to the Active Speech Sharing Scholarship on Teresa Deevy Keynote presentations. Presently, I will invite Hugh to formally open the conference, but first I would like to say a few words about today's format. If you wish to view the Irish Sign Language translation alongside today's speakers, please select the speaker option in your Zoom settings. We have also enabled the live transcript so that delegates can view the automatic captions as needed. Creating an inclusive conference design is a core value underpinning this event. We are very grateful to Michael Feeney, Vanessa O'Connell, Isabel Walsh, and Amanda Coogan for their Irish Sign Language support over the last few months. We also sincerely thank the panelists and presenters for contributing their scholarship and for creating accessible presentations. We hope this experience encourages us all to commit to making our teaching and research more accessible. Many thanks also to our WIT colleagues at the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning for ensuring the smooth running of today's events. We are also very grateful to our colleagues at Maynooth University Library, whose collaboration has been a vital one for us at WIT. In particular, we thank Hugh Murphy, whose commitment to Deevy and open access formats has continued to motivate the project. As part of the team's commitment to making material accessible, we would like to remind you that today's session is being recorded, and it, along with most of the website material, will be archived in the Teresa Deevy archive for future generations of students, practitioners, and scholars. Today's session is divided into two parts. Our first keynote from Professor Anne M. Shanahan will then be followed by a question and answer session and a refreshment break, and then we will hear from Professor Chris Morash. We invite you to post your thoughts, questions and feedback in the chat function throughout the session, and Una and I will moderate the Q&A conversation. And now, over to Hugh Murphy, Head of Collections and Content at Maynooth University Library.
Thank you, Kate. Colleagues and friends, I have been a librarian for 25 years, and I honestly can't recall very few collaborations which were so fruitful as the one we in Maynooth have with our colleagues Una and Kate. It's only been a few years. It has yielded many positive results, and this week's events represent the culmination of what we might call phase one of this collaboration. As a librarian, openness and accessibility should be central tenets of what we do, and it's particularly gratifying that these sentiments are shared by Una and Kate. And of course, when you consider the life and work of Teresa Deevy, it would be ironic, if not almost perverse, to put up barriers to the research we have been privileged to be exposed to this week. And yet there are many ways in which doing so would have been easier. That would not do justice to Teresa Deevy, nor, I think we would suggest, would it do justice to the work of our many contributors, whose work and efforts deserve exposure and consideration by as wide, inclusive and diverse an audience as possible. With respect to the many people who contributed to this event, I'd like to thank all involved, from the support we've had from our respective institutions, the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning, Theatre Studies, the English team and Waterford Institute of Technology, and the Department of English, and particularly the University Library, Maynooth University. Also, we would like to thank those who've helped us turn our aspirations around accessibility into a reality, So particularly Dr. Suzanne Beneff, Head of the School of Humanities at WIT, Maynooth University Library, Tracy Mahini at Waterford Libraries, and the WIT Teaching and Learning Excellence Award. Now, I mentioned this is the culmination of phase one, and it will hopefully stimulate further thoughts and events of this kind. Like so many literary figures, Teresa Deevy, her work, her archive, represents a liminal space, and it allows us to consider literature, education, social and cultural history, the practice of archives, and the world of the theatre, and the intersections within. And we should never, ever stop trying to explore not just our own areas of expertise, but also to learn from complementary areas of study and practice. I'll hand you back to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. I am now delighted to welcome and to introduce Professor Anne M. Shanahan. Anne is a scholar artist specialising in feminist directing and pedagogy, gender and theatrical space, and theatre and social change. She is chair of the Department of Theatre at Purdue University and artistic director and producer of Purdue Theatre. Prior to joining the faculty at Purdue in 2019, she was an associate professor of theatre and women's studies and gender studies at Loyola University Chicago for 20 years. As well as being the volume editor and contributor to the forthcoming Landscapes of Perception, Meredith Monk, Robert Wilson, and Richard Foreman, Anne is the founding co-editor of the peer-reviewed section of the SDC Journal, the official publication of the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society. She also served as the vice president for the 2018 Association for Theatre in Higher Education Conference. Anne's professional directing credits include, to mention but a few, Sarah Ruhl's adaptation of Virginia Woolf's Orlando, and Drums in the Night with the Brecht Company. She has brought this knowledge to the university classroom, directing, again to name but a few, Mackinac, Hedda Gabler, Our Country's Good, and Fefu and Her Friends. Una and I were drawn to Anne's work because it occupies that space where teaching, practice, and research coexist equally, one informing the other. Her exploration of feminist theatre strategies in recent publications, such as Pirated Pedagogy, Repurposing Brecht's Performance Technologies for Revolutions in Teaching in 2018, to the inspirational Making Rooms, Staging Plays About Women and Houses in 2019, speak to the themes and acts of resistance found in Deevy's work. The title of Professor Anne M. Shanahan's keynote is Liminal Materialisms in Teresa Deevy's In the Cellar of My Friend and Late Plays for Radio.
Thank you, Kate. What a wonderful introduction, truly. And I would like to start by thanking you and Una Keeley for inviting me to participate in this conference. I'm humbled to be included with Christopher Morris and the several scholars and students of Teresa Deevy's work contributing to this conference. Truly, thank you for the honor of this experience. While this sort of acknowledgement at the top of a talk such as this is customary, I'd like to take a moment to express the specific profundity for me as a woman, a scholar, and an artist practitioner of Irish descent, nearly 100%. There's a small German portion that we don't claim. The specifics of my experience have been powerful and are central to my thinking about Teresa Deevy's plays and what I'm excited to share in this talk. I think my experience points to something large at work in Deevy's project as an artist, central to the significance of her dramaturgy. Just over a year ago, out of the blue, I received an email from Kate McCarthy. Dear Professor Shanahan, we are convening a conference on the work of Irish playwright and theater maker Teresa Deevy. Her work was produced at the Abbey, and most of you know what I'll share about the production history after that. We will convene a conference here in Waterford, and the crediting, of course, Mayneth and the other supporters of this conference. Our aim in convening the conference is to provide a forum for Deevy scholars to think and talk about Deevy's work and to support current research. We are particularly drawn to your research on considerations of space and style, the house as symbol, woman's body in the theatrical space, and the challenge and opportunities realism presents to theater practice and for playwrights. In addition, we're drawn to your pedagogical approach and feels it aligns with our own here at WIT. Therefore, we invite you to consider delivering a keynote address at the conference if the dates below suit your schedule. We anticipate your address would focus on your research to date, and we would not expect an analysis of Deevy's work. Given your practice, experience, and your insightful scholarship, you are perfectly placed to engage our audience, and we'd be delighted if you would consider this invitation. I read this email as if I was in a dream. To have my scholarship read by two women from across the world, Ireland, no less, to be asked to engage with an Irish playwright, a woman whose work I did not know at that point, drawn by subjects I'd written about hesitantly at first, embarrassedly, but which have now taken on a life of their own, my life's work. From myself, my body, my history, my love of the theater and of thought, and of sharing thought in embodied form in the theater, the word made flesh. I wondered at first whether the email was a joke from a friend who knew me well enough to know what I would care most about, or a prank by a particularly astute student with a grudge. The perfect alignment of the request with my lifelong fantasies of being seen, of being known, having my most intimate work recognized, and from Ireland, defied my expectations of reality. I must say also, I admit to feeling like something of an interloper as I've prepared for this. I'm not a Deevy scholar akin to Christopher Morris, to Una and Kate, or indeed any of you who are contributing to this conference. And while I don't wish to suggest equivalence between Deevy and myself, I've had with this invitation a similar experience, I think, to what Deevy felt watching her first play at the Abbey, when she wrote, much younger than me, that she had a sense of all of her life leading to that moment. When the great day came, it seemed to me, she wrote, I had been working all my life for this day, or rather night. Little did I know how much that was true until I began to read Deevy's plays. From the first pages of Temporal Powers, I not only immediately understood the depth of connection between my work and Deevy's writing, in particular, her treatment of domestic space on stage and its relationship to the depiction of women and conflicts between the genders. I felt a prompting which became an ever deepening pull to go further in my research and analysis than I have gone heretofore, to be more honest, more open, more deep than I had been before. And here I pause to acknowledge a constant companion, a voice, a presence that visits me and says, this is too personal. You're talking too much about yourself. Get to Deevy, Annie. That's what they're here for. And I'll take a moment to dialogue with that voice and bring him out into the open and discuss. As a Brecht-trained scholar, artist, and a feminist, I've been guided by the idea that the personal is political. The role of the personal in making true, full meaning as an artist in the theater. And I've written as a scholar with this idea central, not only bringing the personal to the conversation, but bringing the specifics of my body, specifically my woman's body, to encounters with the material at hand, with relationships, with movements, with speech, with space, in moments of performance for an audience. Working from the basis of my body has led to analysis of space from an embodied perspective as a woman subject. as opposed to the long-held, historically standard perspective of looking from the outside in, with woman as all object of a traditionally male gaze. The centrality of the personal relates to the project in Irish theater in the early mid 20th century, and indeed the focus of realism from the late 19th century to focus on subjects which had not been focused on before: lower classes, women, people outside of the traditional official public realm. I read with interest Deevy's notes, autobiographical notes included in the second volume of Teresa Deevy Reclaimed, that her impetus to start writing plays came from one night returning from the theater. I felt strongly the urge to put the sort of life we live in Ireland into a play. And the quote that refers to her inspiration from Shaw's Heartbreak House, wanting to follow the tradition of putting a fantasy in the Russian manner in English themes, but written for Irish themes. I've long been aware that my fascination with domestic space, women on stage, and the conflict between the genders comes from my personal experience, including my parents' divorce as a child, a traumatic breakup of our family home, a move from a small rural town in Ontario, Canada, to inner city Detroit in the United States, for my mother to be closer to her mother and sisters, being raised by a single mother in Detroit without much money, and my mother's subsequent brief period of homelessness when I was a young adult. Reading Deevy's plays prompted a realization of the broader context of my experiences and research interests specific to my Irish roots, that the turmoil of poverty, of rootlessness, homelessness, of separation was deep in my DNA, my father's and my mother's DNA, and in experiences specifically Irish, that the conflicts between the genders, relationship of the body and bodily needs and sexuality to spaces and to public dynamics that resonate within my research fascinations had deep foundations that I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. My father is an ex-priest and my mother was briefly a novice, both educated in Catholic schools, and my mother raised us while working for the Women's Catholic College where she went to school. I've long understood the breakdown of my parents' marriage as related to gender dynamics in the Catholic Church, the role of the body and of sexuality in the Catholic tradition for both genders. There's a whole strain of thought I could go into about my family history as a vaudeville act in America. It is interesting, and I'd love to talk about it at some other time. They formed a group called the Four Mortons. This is my father's family. They changed their name from Kennedy because Kennedy was too Irish. And they performed in the teens and 20s and 30s on the vaudeville circuit, interestingly performing Irish family squabbles as their act. In the first pages of Temporal Powers, I immediately observed the resonance of my preoccupation with the experience of dislocation from home central to the piece, the sense of loss around domestic space, the setting in a ruin, a conflict between materialist concerns of Min Donovan and the Catholicism of her husband, as he's noted in the cast of characters, Michael and Father O'Brien. The prospect of immigration to America and the centrality of that to an Irish experience of the time, the depression, and I'll note not mere depression, but full of despair of the central character. Also the sense of dislocation and separation, of abandonment, and in particular in the case of Min at the end, her concern for childlessness relative to separation from her husband. As I read Deevy's plays, I've come to be aware of the following two items. One, how my fascinations are personal, but are also part of an Irish experience, perhaps particularly for women or between the genders relating to women in a unique way, and why perhaps of all the people in the world, from all the places in the world, it was two women from Ireland who are scholars on Deevy's plays and feminists who saw something in my work and reached out to me to participate in this contest. My experience reading Deevy's plays and applying my rubric of analysis to them has been a healing process, a profound life experience, an acknowledgement of myself as a woman in her 50s, going through a life reckoning similar to the characters in Deevy's plays, connecting my unique embodied experience to the history of bodies and culture, and bringing this to bear on an understanding of Deevy's work, which I'll share with you today. And here again, I hear that voice, this is too personal, but what I want to stress is that I want to tie my personal experience to my main point, what has become the argument of my keynote, that the dramaturgy of Teresa Deevy's plays, both the early realistic plays and the later plays for radio, work in specific, complex ways to draw out an experience which is deep, intimate, personal, and ultimately aimed at healing, at union, and at love. The content, form, and style of her plays work together, drawing from her own changing embodied material experiences as a woman, the specifics of her time, theater of the time, Irish history, to work towards an extremely unique, personal, and collective, intimate experience for audiences of her plays, of reconciliation, transformation, and accommodations, particularly perhaps for women. I want to review briefly my research to date so that you have a context for some of the features of the rubric that I've developed for thinking about women and houses in theater and drama. So this comes from an article which you will have access to. I may skim parts of it. It's the chapter this chapter is called Making Rooms, Staging Plays About Women and Houses, and I can put the citational material in the chat if you all don't have it after I'm done speaking. Since Aeschylus, playwrights have used the setting of a house to depict conflicts between the genders on stage and have then manipulated spatial dramaturgy to illuminate this content. This tactic was common in the late 19th century, particularly in relation to women and houses. Anton Chekhov directly connects houses to pivotal female characters in all of his plays, and houses figure prominently in several plays by Heinrich Ibsen and George Bernard Shaw. In the decades after Nora crossed the threshold, playwrights have employed a similar strategy across different forms and styles that correspond to women's changing social positions and with consideration of how issues surrounding race and sexuality intersect with gender and space. For the last 15 years, I've focused on the subject of women and houses and more broadly gender and space in my work as a theater director. Through the practice-based work of staging a series of plays with these subjects, I've discovered similar features in both plot and spatial dramaturgy that are expressed explicitly through stage directions or implied by the conventions of staging at the time. Common features include a plot-based connection between a house and a woman's creativity, sexual, artistic, or intellectual. A pivotally plotted transition for the woman in relation to the house through its sale, abandonment, or her removal. The significance of domestic and other spatial borders, the threat or actualization of violence, typically involving guns, although interestingly not in Deevy, a climactic, unexpected death or departure of the central female character, usually from a significant location in the house, and finally, communal reaction to this death or departure dramatized in the denouement. The consistent appearance of these features, spanning back to ancient Greek plays, suggests a meaningful, perhaps even essential connection between houses, women, and their theatrical representation, a connection with important ramifications for dramatic criticism and theater production. Taken together, these common features form a pattern that can be tracked across plays and historical periods, Accordingly, the overall significance of a play's dramaturgical project might be best appreciated when considered in dialogue with other texts containing these same tropes. This approach allows a director to support the dramaturgy of an individual play text while also engaging, even challenging, the larger ongoing story of gender and space in the theatrical representation and across history. I therefore combine traditional scholarly approaches with practice-based methodologies in order to consider the material details of the production process in my analysis of gender and domestic space. I think it's especially relevant since the depiction of women and houses on stage directly engages materialist critical considerations, the root word matter, mother, that urge us to examine the practical constraints of budget, space, and labor in meaning-making processes. Seen in this way, the material constraints in production mirror the limits presented by domestic spaces for the women in these plays. And a director's response to, for example, limited budgets has potential to inform her interpretation of spatial conflicts in the plays. As opposed to using a traditional model that separates conceptual analysis from practical aspects of production, I move back and forth between theory and practice to engage feminist experiential methodologies explicitly and reveal how material limits can inspire artistic choices, thereby exposing resonance between the fictitious conflicts in the plays and the real life constrictions that artists often face when producing them. I first noted parallels across plays about women and houses when I staged Hedda Gabler and Medea by Euripides in the same year. In an article of greater length, I explore more fully how female creativity, sexual, artistic, intellectual, relates to domestic space in both these plays. The first foundational pattern around women and houses is that the woman's creativity and agency and conflicts surrounding those relate to the domestic space in the play. These are connected to the house, which can be read as the woman's body. Inspired by feminist analysis of ancient Greek theatrical practice, I understand representations of the house on stage as inherently related to social and political shifts along gender lines in the 5th century BCE. In women's theatrical space, Hanna Skolnikoff traces the evolution of domestic space on stage in relation to women's changing social position in society from the Greeks to the present day. Skolnikoff's argument is based on the implementation of the skene in ancient Greece and its iconic separation of public and private space, oikos and polos, female and male. The face of the house thus marks the barrier between the genders, and it is only on the threshold that man and woman can meet. The border of the house on stage separates public and private space and marks masculine and feminine domains. Thus, exchange across those lines is charged and physically, materially generative. This sexual exchange around houses in the Western theatrical tradition has additional significance when we consider the Greek god Dionysus governed both theater and fertility. The stage on stage is therefore a creative space of reproduction, potent with meaning in relation to the community surrounding it. The power of the exchange across this border, this liminal space, is explored in Medea and Hedda. Both Euripides and Ibsen present female characters at a crisis of creativity and foreground their limited options in space through strong scenic shifts in relation to the house, particularly at the dramatic climax. In his famous use of Deus Ex Machina, Euripides frees Medea from the conflict in a chariot, raising her in the mechane, the scenic crane, away from the house beyond the reach of retribution. Like Medea, Hedda's assumption of power involves child killing when she kills her pregnant self. And as with Euripides' sudden shift in style with the appearance of the crane from behind the skene, Ibsen emphasizes these final actions spatially and stylistically by placing Hedda's suicide in the upstage room that holds the infamous portrait of General Gabler. Doing so links her death not only to her restriction within the house and the world of her father, but also the entrapment within the theatrical frame of realism. According to Skolnikov, late 19th century realism's move into the previously offstage space of the domestic interior, now shared for the first time by both genders, necessitated a retreat of the female subject even deeper into or out of her historically private frame. Considering the architecture of the proscenium theater and the apparatus of viewing within it, Sue Ellen Case critiques the realism of this period as a prison house of art for women. Case, along with Jill Dolan, Ellen Diamond, and others, have argued that the privileged position vis-a-vis a fourth wall invokes a male gaze and colludes with other stylistic features to objectify female characters. Thus, when Ibsen pushes the female subject deep into the symbolic frame of representation, where her lack of escape route is most viscerally obvious, he emphasizes the restriction of women in that style. Rather than call attention to the limits of space by incongruously shifting styles, as Euripides does with the crane above the scene house in Medea, Ibsen emphasizes the restriction of women in his respective style by doubling its definitive frame. These carefully located climactic acts usually involve violence, most often inflicted by the central female character against herself and/or her offspring. Thwarted by social limits, the central female characters are left with no agency over their creative power except to kill it and/or abruptly leave. I mentioned the common feature of guns in the plays that I've considered heretofore, and I'll say more about how those are not present, interestingly, in Divi. I'll track one final common feature among these plays about women in houses is this scripted reaction to the violent climax by members of a surrounding community. Examples include the chorus's reminder in Medea that the fates don't give us what we expect, and Judge Brack's often cited line from the end of Medea, "People don't do such things." These concluding lines provide important direction to the audience how to interpret the disruption posed by the climax. The chorus attempts to contextualize what has happened in the shared faith system. Judge Brack scrambles to reinstate the Victorian norms he used to manipulate Hedda. These scripted reactions either reinscribe norms or suggest new possibilities given their obvious inadequacy in addressing or containing what has occurred. In summary, through tracing a pattern of common features, I found that the central actions of plays about women in houses either lead to what I call an implosion, a final move of the central character into the deepest part of the house, metaphorically up into her womb, or to an explosion, an exploration or traversal of the borders of the space and/or representational style. In either case, playwrights call attention to the borders between spaces, between genders, between art and life. This borderline thereby functions as a site of creative exchange, in particular between the genders. As Bertolt Brecht's theories suggest, occupation of this line breaks the fourth wall that exposes the performative aspects of behavior, which can extend to include those surrounding gender. Traversal or occupation of this line has potential to free the woman subject from what feminist critics identify as the limits of the realistic frame and the fourth wall, thereby destabilizing the status quo and bursting stereotypes. This last point about the liminal space and the potency of the liminal space is key, and it relates to where I'm going to pick up with Divi. Essentially, in the plays I read, which albeit are limited, of Teresa Divi, this is where she starts. She starts on the line. She starts in the liminal space. In addition to sexual exchange, moves on this border allow for both the symbolic and actual meeting and merging of the sexes, undermining a gender binary, allowing for fluid transitions and skewing heteronormative rules. Because it also marks a line between what can be seen and what cannot, the facade of the skene, or any house on stage, can be linked to the mask and to the act of mimesis itself. As a result, playful movements across the line demarcating public and private space at the border of the house on stage, and more broadly, between the stage and the auditorium, open up new possibilities for challenging gender expressions on stage and off. It is this border or liminal space that I've occupied and manipulated in my production experiments concerning women in houses, gender, and space. And as I say, I think this is where Devi starts, and her plays evolve in manipulation of this line in content, form, and style in multiple ways throughout her career. To illustrate my method and its impact on production choices, I created a list of questions which I've developed to chart a woman's relationship to domestic space in a play text and enhance appreciation of the related meaning of the material realities of the production process. I found that addressing these questions can powerfully inform a director's main task, illuminating the interpretation of space in the play, and suggest design and staging choices, lending meaning to the material circumstances of the production process. The questions are as follows, and then I'll relate them to some of Devi's plays. Number one, who is the central woman in the play, and what is her relation to the house? How is this connected to her creativity, sexual, intellectual, artistic, and cultural? Two, does her relationship to the house change? If so, how does this transition resolve? Does it involve violence, child killing, and/or guns? Where does the dramatic conclusion occur spatially in relation to the house? That's number three. Four, how does the community respond? Five, how does the setting of the house fit into the designated playing space? How does this impact the dynamics of the conflict and the audience's relationship to the space and story? Six, where are the borders, both actual, material, and stylistic, metaphoric? Does the style of the play change? Seven, are choices regarding the material limits of production, budget, casting pool, time, space, events, meaningful in relation to the themes and conflicts within the play? It's these last three questions, 5, 6, and 7, relating to how the setting of the house, quote unquote, fits both into the realities of the playing space, the auditorium, and into the material circumstances of production, that I think the most potency comes in understanding Teresa Devi's overall project, particularly her late plays for radio. And now I'll undertake that project of applying this rubric to the plays that I've had the pleasure of reading of Devi's. As soon as I began reading Devi's plays, I saw the profound applicability of this analytic framework to them. I also saw its inadequacy. I saw how my rubric would be complicated and deepened by the relationship between the subjects of women and houses in the form and style of her plays, that my research would be forever changed, expanded by this encounter. While I once feared I would not have enough to say on Teresa Devi, I now have too much to say. So I'll focus my observations to general trends in responses to the questions of the rubric in a handful of plays and synthesize the ideas towards some conclusion. I'll consider these subjects in Temporal Powers, Katie Roche, The King of Spain's Daughter, In the Cellar of My Friends, and with some concluding observations on Light Falling. One is immediately struck by the presence of women at the center of all Teresa Devi's plays, at least those that I read. Importantly, there's also more than one woman in each instance, and a generational range, which is significant to the meaning of their relationship within the plays. There are several characters, including women in their 50s. And I would like to share how profound an experience it's been to immerse myself in the world of these plays over the last several months. I've never encountered as many women in their 50s in plays as I have in Teresa Devi's plays. This in itself is meaningful, but is impacting to the overall argument that I intend to make about their dramaturgical project. Each of the plays is set in a domestic space or in a space that draws on architectural features of or pieces of domestic space in meaningful ways. From Temporal Powers to In the Cellar of My Friend, the defining characteristics of the space is its liminality. Common to all of the spaces in the plays I read are open doors and partial walls. There's an open door or a full-length window in the upstage center of each of the plays under consideration here. Other common features include vantage points for looking from a height, whether that be from standing on a wall or on a ladder or on tiptoe. The phrase standing to full height recurs several times in her plays, or the vantage point of a house on a location at the top of a hill looking down on scenes below. Each of the play's plots surrounds a question of marriage centrally and a conflict between the genders, often across generations, regarding the marriages proposed or already occurring. It bears mention that there's a center table in Katie Roche and in the Cellar of My Friend, downstage of the upstage center door. This is reminiscent of the center table in the last act of A Doll's House, the site of the negotiation between Nora and Torvald, the negotiation between the man and wife, between the genders enacted there. The women other than the central woman character figure in the conflict to a large degree, and notably when it comes to defining the central woman character's relationship to the domestic space, to the house. Related, striking in Temporal Powers, the relation to the house is unstable. There is transience, hardship, and trauma surrounding the domestic space. This seems true most prominently in the plays of the 30s. The woman's relationship to the house is more stable in the later plays, though central questions about the nature of the woman's relationship to the house remain. Related both to this transient and to the table is the role of food in the plays. Potatoes in Temporal Powers, scones in Katie Roche, Patricia's relationship to toast and insistence on eating breakfast in the Cellar of My Friends, and the fettling of the dogs, potatoes in Light Falling, lunch arriving in The King of Spain's Daughter. Food is connected to bodies and to the material concerns at the center of the play's content and the meaning of their styles. In each of the plays, the woman's relationship to the house is in question and or changes over the course of the play. In several of the plays, the role of maiden sisters figures in determining and redetermining their relationship to the house. Working out of where they're going to live figures large, both in the initial and ending relationships of the central woman to the houses. Striking in relation to the plays which inform the development of my rubric, in contrast to the plays which inform the development of my rubric, none of the women in the center of Deevy's plays have children. And while their childlessness is a factor, in the case of Min Donovan or Mary Scully, the symbolic and real creative conflict or destruction of children does not figure in the plays. The woman's sexuality, desire is at play in each, notably Katie Roche and The King of Spain's Daughter, as well as Light Falling. This factors into their relationship to the house. Regarding the second question, whether violence occurs at the moment of transition in the woman's relationship to the house, this does occur certainly in the plays of Deevy that I've read, and relates to the houses, to their marriages, and to the women's sexuality. But notably, the violence is not enacted by guns, but by the hands or a stick in hand of an older man in the plays, usually a father against a child, a daughter, or in certain cases, a son. What I'm excited to share is that applying this rubric has been both limiting and revelatory. I've come to appreciate some of the deeper underpinnings of my interests in women in houses to an Irish cultural past. But I've had to expand the rubric to include some new features which are important to that past and important to me personally. I've had to include the strong presence of these older unmarried women and their relationship to the houses, and the childlessness of the women. That expansion both helps to explain the profound liminality in the spaces of the plays and has created room for a deeper experience in me one that has been transformative and healing. Importantly, these personal encounters with the plays allow me to understand how they function, resonant with the ways material circumstances of production reveal dynamics in the plays themselves. Applying the embodied materialist feminist approach based in practice, based in my body, to my reading of the places has yielded an understanding of what I think is DV's larger project, one which reveals dramaturgical components of the radio plays, but also informs appreciation of the content, form, and style of the plays from the 30s performed at the Abbey. I'm just going to take a drink of water. Speaking of material concerns, I feel a need for it, and I want to be true to my body in this moment and take a drink before I finish with my conclusion. Thank you. So there are many ways to illustrate this point, but I'll start with the climax of the plays, which is the focus of my rubric and central to the dramaturgy of Devy's plays, as well as most plays in the Western tradition. The climax of all the plays involve a woman working out a profound decision, which involves her relation to the domestic space at the end of the play. Scholars included in this conference have commented about how interior experience is not spoken, but needs to be read between the lines. Christopher Morris writes, Devy's plays do their work in what is happening between the lines. Emily Bloom writes in a wonderful paper included in this conference about this gap, and that it reveals Devy's, quote, conflicted feelings about the limits of language in translating visual phenomenon. I would argue that making sense of these moments of transition, decision, struggle, transformation at the end of these plays for the women requires an engagement by the spectator or the reader to read between the lines and experience with, to feel alongside with the characters in the plays, particularly the central women characters. This strikes me as the pleasure of what occurs when we encounter a realistic play by, for example, Chekhov or Ibsen, that we relate to this profound interior struggle as a universal human moment. I've never been to Moscow, I've never wanted to be to Moscow, and yet I appreciate on a deep level the existential experience of the sisters as they pine for that future. This seems to me related to the idea of the fantasy in the Russian style that Devy is aiming towards. This rumination on something personal and universal, a profound life moment which we somehow feel all together sitting in the theater or encountering the plays that are meant to be read within the physical, meant to be enacted within the physical constraints of the theater space. Particularly profound for me as a woman of Irish descent is feeling through these moments with the women in a moment of struggle. The opportunity to focus on this many women is rare, even in contemporary drama today. I was fascinated, super engaged, imagining the exchange between Min and Michael Donovan, the reckoning they engage with, like the trials in the house of the magistrate down the hill and in the body of the house of the ruin on stage. They engage in a trial of their marriage in the last play, in the last moments of the play. While they reckon, Min gathers the stuff of their home, the stool, the various few belongings they have, into her shawl, which Michael has just asked her to take off her shoulders. I watched, riveted, drawn physically, as Min and Michael try to reforge a connection after he learns of her plot to harm him, facing the material separation of his departure for America and her being left significantly childless. As they leave their liminal lodging, the ruin, disconnected, resigned to their separation, Michael puts over his back the shawl just shortly ago warming Min's body. Their temporal home, even more liminal, shifted across gendered bodies as they leave the house and the border of the stage frame. In The King of Spain's Daughter, the revolution is worked out ultimately between two women, in a likewise complicated dance between the liminal and the material, like the contradiction of the road signs that frame it. My informal reference for the space of The King of Spain's Daughter is a symphony of liminality. Other scholars, and if I had time, I would outline all of the liminal features presented simply in the stage directions of that play, let alone their enactment. The wall partially disintegrating, an open door within the center of the wall, a road leading somewhere, but with contradictory signs, the time of day, a lunchtime into from early day to late day, time of year, April. On the one hand, Annie longs for and herself embodies bodily and sexual freedom in the world of the play. She's drawn to the practical material consistency of the person who saves in the way Jim does, which becomes her deciding point for marrying him. But she also resists this. Simultaneously, she needs to move past the real to fantasy, to romanticize this so that she can buy into this. The form this takes is likewise contradictory. She imagines the practical material Mrs. Marx. And I wonder, I think this is pretty far-fetched, but I wonder if there's some kind of pun on Marx and materialism with Karl Marx in that name. I think that's really a stretch, but I keep thinking it, and so I choose to share it here. The resolution is worked out on Mrs. March when she praises Jim as a sensible boy. Annie imagines her body hurt, her throat cut by the man she wishes Jim to be. The climax of Katie Roche is likewise complicated in its liminal toggling between the romantic and the material. This climactic moment of Katie Roche echoes The King of Spain's Daughter, as the disruption is caused largely by Kate being too free with the boys. Similarly, the resolution happens between two women, Amelia and Kate, alone on stage, and they form a bond. They decide together, make a pact, how they're going to frame the life experience to be brave and to make it grand. Kate comments that Amelia was always brave, and they make a promise between the two of them. What strikes me here is that the women are making sense together of a profound contradiction in their experience, bringing it into their bodies and framing it together collectively so that they can continue, acknowledging that this bravery, this brave reframing, has been a part of Amelia's experience as a woman later in her life for a long time. Kate is moving into that with her. But it's this experience of the bond between the women. They're literally clasping hands that marks, in my experience, the nature of the resolution at the end of this play. This is where In the Cellar of My Friends picks up, in a moment of physical connection between two women. Literally, Belle and Patty clasp hands with each other as they come into, as Belle enters through the open window in the upstage space of In the Cellar of My Friends. It's interesting actually to look at these two plays, Katie Roche and In the Cellar of My Friend, in direct contrast to each other, because they're a sort of reverse mirror image. The coming together of the two women and then the departure of the young woman from the space in Katie Roche, the entrance of the young woman into the space and the clasping hands in The Cellar of My Friends initiates a sort of inverse and deeper exploration of the dynamics at work, I think, through Deevy's career around women and space, and particularly the importance of the connection between women to how women are able to relate to those spaces. The climax of In the Cellar of My Friends is extraordinarily dense. it's extraordinarily dense and difficult to summarize in words within the play itself, as well as in the context of this paper. But the struggle to understand, to feel with the characters in the play, to understand what they are trying to get at, feels central to the dramaturgy in this play as well. My examination of women in houses on stage is founded on inclusion of the personal, placing my body into the equation as the site of authority and source of knowing. Drawing from my specific physical experience of my body has led me to a reading of the plays that emanates from my body, from my experience. And based on this, I came to a reading of the plays and more broadly, their meaning and performance. Working from these feminist principles, the personal and the embodied, leads me to a reading of Deevy's plays based on my bodily experience, my embodied experience reading them, to understand them as reconciling, healing, perhaps for women in particular, in the moment of performance. This reconciling happens in a liminal space between the ideal and the material, which the women occupy and which occurs in their bodies. This reconciling, this embodying of liminal space is created in the exchange between women with each other. That liminal spaces collide with each other, collude with each other to form a collective web of liminality, of material liminality. Sorry, I'm reading chats as seeing if that chat was for me. And I think that it's this complex, interwoven liminality between the women in the plays in particular that accounts for the profound liminality of the spaces, both the physical plays and the radio plays. Reading the plays in this light, I've come to an interpretation of the meaning of the content, form, and style of the radio plays, similar to Emily Bloom's conclusion in her insightful paper for this conference, Blindness and Insight in Teresa Deevy's radio plays. Rather than reading the radio plays as a compromise, while they may have been in certain ways, to read them through the lens that they are seen as a continuation and advancement of Deevy's dramaturgical aims through her earlier plays, indeed through her whole career. The dramaturgy of the radio plays provides a key to appreciating features of the earlier plays and their power. Emily Bloom's paper leads us to a reading of the visual in Deevy's radio plays and the meaning of the gap between the visual and the oral. She draws on the aesthetics of disability and disability studies for illuminating an insightful paper about the role of the visual in the radio plays. I propose that in addition to the visual element of the dramatic world, that the radio's dramas reference and create something embodied, that they reference the experience of the material moment of being in the theater, of watching actors, actresses work through something in their physical bodies, and that we respond to that moment in our bodies as we would in the theater, that this is signaled through the visuality of the radio plays and also through the prominence of the physical spaces within the plays, the importance of the physical spaces in the plays. Thus, in The Cellar of My Friend, we're drawn not only to imagine the visual scene of climax, but we're sorting it through as if we were in the theater as audience with the actors sorting it through in their bodies. Talk about multiple material liminal layers occurring at once. It's as if Deevy is mining the potential of the form available to her, radio, to posit the same truth that she's been exploring in her earlier plays for and between women. It's as if she's trying to provide that experience more directly through the potentialities and limits of the radio medium, that imagining the embodiment or the embodied experience in the theater is somehow more expressive of the truth of life than seeing it enacted in the theater. The theater perhaps cannot contain the fullness of the liminal medium that she's striving for. In Light Falling, which is a mid-career play, a later play, 1946, if I'm not mistaken, there's a complex metaphor about the truth of experience. The painter, Mr. Leslie, says, "For me, truth is embodied in light falling." I posit that the radio plays are an effort for Devi to try to create this experience of light falling in a way which is deeply feminist and which is material at its core. I know I'm running close to end of time, and so I will summarize these last points to my best ability, so that we can get to some good discussion, I hope. The women in the plays that I've considered all connect to something material centrally within their role within the play. Min Donovan is constantly drawing us back to material concerns. Mrs. Marks in her focus on the sensibility of marriage. Amelia's scones, Patty's insistence that they eat breakfast. The women are constantly toggling back to a concern for the material. Devi seems fascinated with the idea of what spaces can contain, what they have the potential to contain. And this comes up over and over again within the plays. In The Cellar of My Friends, there's an interesting metaphor around a basket which is holding flowers. Belle brings in a basket and she comments on it, saying, "It's nothing really but a platform for the roses to rest on, and the great handle arching over them like a rainbow, no sides, nothing to hold on, but they hold on." And Patty says, "It's just an ordinary garden basket, but those roses." The material liminism of the roses is significant too in what they are. Belle brings them as a gift for Patricia, but the roses belong to Patricia because they're from her garden. And ultimately, Belle will take over as the woman of the house when she marries Tom at the end of the play. This idea of what a space can contain seems central to Devi's overall project and is particularly explored with particular profundity, I think, in the play Light Falling. And so I'm going to conclude with just the very briefest, literally half a page analysis of the play Light Falling, because I think it's actually a key to understanding Devi's project in the late plays. Through her career, actually. I was profoundly moved by Light Falling. It was the last play that I read, and I literally broke down in tears as I read it. I felt a physical resolution in my body at the pain I felt at the separation of Min and Michael Donovan at the first play I read, Temporal Powers. The beauty of that love expressed between them as recognized by Pat when he relates it as the moment of light falling to Mr. Leslie. The combination of features within that dramaturgical moment had an impact on me physically that literally took me to sobbing, took me to tears. And I think that play contains a potency for complex analysis about what Devi's aiming at in her whole career. Mr. Leslie talks about light falling as being the ultimate expression of truth. And Pat and Mr. Leslie muse on the potential destruction of capturing a moment, that you destroy it as you capture it. I think what Devi is doing in that play is effectively capturing a moment that does not destroy it. And its features include the experience of the radio play, Pat sitting on the dancing board, listening to the moment of resolution between Mary and John Scully as they come to their moment of synthesis. He hears it as if a radio play, but we see it through the experience of watching it in the imagined moment of enactment in the theater. So it combines the radio play with the visual, with the embodied, and that this all together forms the rare moment, which is the moment of light falling, the truth that I think Devi is aiming to express in her liminal spaces throughout her entire career. Thank you for letting me share this today.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I think a round of applause from everyone is so very, so yeah, you've really earned it. Thank you. That was just so moving and personal and reflective and so layered. And one never expects their email to form part of a keynote. So I will just keep that in mind for the future. I know that Una and I had invited you to think about In the Cellar of My Friend, because it was a text that we were somewhat struggling with to try and understand it. And what you've shared and what you've taught me today is that in taking that embodied approach, that lets us in to Deevi's world and into her text. So thank you. You've given us a way forward in the next part of our analysis. There's many comments and questions. I'm actually going to start off with something from a comment from one of our colleagues, Dr. Jenny O'Connor. And she reflects that this foregrounding of embodied experience is such a liberating approach that many of us women often feel we can't include because it's not academic enough, or because we've never considered our bodies or ourselves as important enough to the conversation. And she thought it was a refreshing keynote at a conference. So we have a couple of minutes and a couple of questions. So I'm going to just go back to the beginning. So the first question from Brona Sharp. And Brona is asking, do you think that Teresa Deevy pushed boundaries through symbolism such as the house? And did this highlight how women felt and were represented at the time? She's talking about Eamon de Valera's 1930s Ireland here. Oh, must just unmute you, Anne.
There we go.
Yep, there you go. Oh, no, sorry, Anne. We'll just, I think maybe it's me and you trying to unmute you. I'll ask you again.
Yes, good.
Go. Perfect, thank you.
Good. I intend to become a better informed on the history of Ireland at this period, because it's so fascinating and seems so important to understanding these plays and indeed to the larger themes that play in them. And I won't pretend to be able to answer this question fully, but it does seem to me like there's this tug, and other scholars in the conference have commented on this in their paper. There's this complex web of layered contradictions, of layered liminalities between the potential for freedom for women, the potential for communication across the sexes, across genders. I think that I think one of the complexities of the plays for me is the capaciousness by which they hold men, and the relationship between women, that the lens that Teresa Deevy brings, which I do think is elementally on some level material and rooted in her experience of her body as a woman. I think it extends to men's material experience within the contradictions of the Irish culture. And I've got a lens on how that figures with Catholicism and sexuality. I've got a lens on how that figures economically, or with the pull between the conceptual and the real. You all in Ireland will have a much deeper sense of how your freedoms around those things are in play, or are in play in terms of what you think is happening with the specific Irish history of that period.
Yes, thank you. And a question here, just for a moment. Ben Quinlan would love an expansion on the Mrs. Marks connection. He felt that even though you said it was a stretch, it just resonated him. So even a 30 seconds, where might you, or indeed he, take that idea going forward?
Well, I guess I really do think that this materialist lens, this materialist feminist lens that's based on Marxism, is really a key towards understanding what's going on in Deevy's plays, even if it's toggling between something else. That I think we're limited if we look at Deevy's plays from a traditional conceptual Aristotelian psychologically based focus on the individual. That and Una's recent article on this in terms of the collectivity of the feminist action in The King of Spain's Daughter really gets at this too. That I think that she is wanting to draw out into something collective, into something that focuses on a collectivity that started with Marx's materialist analysis, but which feminists pick up on in important ways that also includes the body. So I think and I think that's maybe the toggle between that conceptual, psychologically based approach to character and this material collective. I think that's why we've got broken down ruin walls. I think that's why we've got windows that they need to figure out how to board up. I think that's why there's money stashed in the ruins of those liminal spaces, right? She's trying to figure out how to get Marx on stage. She's trying to figure out how to get a materialist analysis on stage.
Thank you. That's plenty work for him to do in the coming years. A comment from Emily that Deevy often observed radio plays in the studio, as she thinks you're absolutely right that embodiment and materialism were key to her understanding of that medium. And I see we're almost coming up to time, so we just have one more comment here perhaps. This is from Lauren Brown. And her comment here is on the close relationship that Deevy had with her sister Nell. And Marianne Doherty quotes Margaret Shanahan, a relation perhaps, who described, quote, "Together they were one person, Nell the ears and Teresa the voice," end quote. That was just a thought that she shared there with us.
I was so interested, I was so curious about that, about how that relationship might have figured into those moments of expression of truth between women and clasping hands, right? Between women in the plays.
Yes. And if anyone wants to hear a little bit more about that, our first practitioners panel investigated that idea and shared that idea in that conversation. So Anne, again, on just behalf of all of us, I extend just such a huge thank you for saying yes to the email and for joining us and for providing us such a rich analysis of Deevy's work and really privileging that embodied lens, which is so important to you, to all of us, and to Deevy. Thank you so much.
It's an honor of my life. Thank you very much, Kate and Una, and all of you.
Thank you. And so now, everyone, we are going to take a 15-minute break for you to have a screen break, perhaps, or a cup of tea, stretch your legs. But we will start back at 3:30 sharp, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good morning. Welcome. Esteemed colleagues, Deevy family members, and Deevy enthusiasts, friends all. Welcome to the second part of the live events of Active Speech, sharing scholarship on Teresa Deevy. A particular welcome and note of thanks again to our Irish Sign Language interpreters, Vanessa O'Connell and Michael Feeney. And a reminder that all our proceedings today will be recorded and archived to support ongoing scholarship on Teresa Deevy. Please feel free to put your thoughts, questions, and feedback into the chat throughout the session. If you wish to view the ISL translation alongside today's speakers, please select Speaker option on your Zoom settings. We have also enabled the live transcript so that delegates can view the automatic captions as needed. The programme of today's events is compact. Sorry, I've lost my place. But we anticipate hugely enjoyable. Apologies. Our events this afternoon will be formally opened by Dr. Eileen Carney, who will also gift Maynooth University her own uniquely valuable Teresa Deevy archive. This is followed by a keynote lecture by one of the key architects in ensuring the conservation and access to the Teresa Deevy archive held by Maynooth University, Christopher Morash, who holds the Seamus Heaney Professorship of Irish Writing within Trinity College Dublin. First, let me introduce you to Eileen Kearney. Eileen has been a leading Irish theatre scholar and director since the 1980s, when her discovery of Teresa Deevy's work prompted years of publishing and lecturing, considering the work of Irish women playwrights. She acted in New York and in Los Angeles before university teaching. She has directed productions and taught university theatre all over the US, including Pomona College, Santa Clara University, Gonzaga University, Webster University, the University of Texas in Austin, Texas A&M University, and the University of Colorado in Denver. At Patricia Burke-Brogan's request, Eileen directed the 2013 American premiere of Stained Glass at Sound. She has published numerous articles in Irish theatre journals, focusing on women's contributions to the field. She is married to Dan Ketting and is a self-proclaimed yarnaholic, winning blue ribbons for knitting and for weaving. She is a feminist activist for 10 years. She is a feminist activist. For 10 years, she volunteered her time teaching knitting at The Gathering Place, a day center for homeless women in Denver, Colorado. Her anthology, Irish Women Dramatists, 1908 to 2001, co-edited with Charlotte Hedrick, is published by Syracuse University Press. She has been a member of the American Conference for Irish Studies since 1985. Eileen pioneered a resurgence of interest into Teresa Deevy's life and work when few others recognized Deevy's name. And in doing so, Eileen began the path that has brought us here together today. It is for this reason that we are honored to invite her to formally open proceedings this afternoon. Eileen.
Thank you so much, Una, and welcome everyone to the second half of today's proceedings. To use a theater analogy, it has been a gift indeed to witness Teresa Deevy center stage and in the spotlight this week at the Active Speech Sharing Scholarship on Teresa Deevy Conference. For years, I have dreamed of the day when Deevy would become known and recognized among scholars, actors, directors, theatergoers, and readers alike. While living in New York City, I remember attending a lecture by Thomas Cahill, the author of How the Irish Saved Civilization. Citing various examples, he pointed out that although many people believe history is made up of huge events and movements, it actually consists of a sequence of many small events which interconnect and culminate in the major event which most people remember. Mulling over his remarks, I recall my university theater students kvetching about being required to study theater history and having to memorize centuries of the who, what, when, where, when in fact the why of theater history was always far more interesting. Their quandary evokes the question of why for so long this talented playwright was kept in the wings instead of on stage. That query still begs to be addressed. Today, I would like to share my moment in the limelight with Sean Dunn, without whose introductions I would not have rediscovered Deevy, and without whose generosity we might not be experiencing this wonderful conference today. In 1983, when I met Sean through John Jordan's introduction, he was working on his Cork Examiner article, Rediscovering Teresa Deevy, to be released a few months later. Had Sean been a territorial academic or an author looking to cash in on his research by selling it to an interested but impoverished graduate student, he might not have shared it with me. But Sean was a poet, the kindest of sensitive souls, who gladly spread the wealth of his findings with me. Like Devi herself, he appreciated the detachment of silence and reflection and was intensely interested in what made people tick, both traits evident in his poetry. I would suggest that the most important realization for us to retain from this conference is its commitment and determination to recognize the gifts, the many small events, as Cahill articulated, that women have contributed to history. It is no coincidence that Devi's contributions were shelved for so long. My own research has taught me firsthand how women's work can be lifted and appear unrecognized in texts or camouflaged in speeches and writings. By bringing to light Teresa Devi's legacy, this conference has taken a step forward toward correcting these wrongs. I am happy to donate to Maynooth University my personal Devi archive, which includes taped interviews, correspondence with those who knew her and guided me, photographs, notes, and journal and book articles I have published. Continuing in the spirit of well-deserved recognition, let me conclude by applauding Chris Morash's outstanding contribution to conserving the archive for researchers like us and for those who will follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eileen. Now, to the second part of today's proceedings, a keynote lecture entitled Knew Naught of All This, Teresa Devi's Dark Matter, delivered by Professor Christopher Morash, the Seamus Heaney Professor of Irish Writing in Trinity College, Dublin. Chris's many publications include Writing the Irish Famine, published by Oxford in 1995, A History of Irish Theatre, 1601 to 2000, published by Cambridge in 2002, A History of the Media in Ireland, published by Cambridge in 2009, and Mapping Irish Theatre with Sean Richards, published by Cambridge in 2013. More recently, Christopher co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Modern Irish Theatre with Nicholas Green, which was published by Oxford in 2016. Significant among Christopher's publications in relation to today's event are the Teresa Devi Reclaimed series, volumes 1 and 2, published in 2011 and 2017 respectively. These were co-edited with Jonathan Bank and John Harrington. Also in relation to Devi, significant amongst Chris's legacy within Irish theatre scholarship is, in particular, in partnership with the Devi family and Jackie Devi in particular, Chris's determination to ensure that Teresa Devi's literary archive, which lived in a green suitcase under the bed for many years, would be preserved and conserved within Maynooth University. Chris was elected to membership of the Royal Irish Academy in 2007 and to fellowship of TCD in 2016. He served as the 74th Vice Provost of Trinity College from 2016 to 2019 and is currently writing a book on Yeats and theatre. but today he's talking and thinking about Teresa Deavy's Dark Matter, and will take questions at the end of his lecture. Please enter these into the chat function and I can put them to Chris on your behalf. Thank you. Esteemed friends, on your behalf, I am pleased to welcome Professor Christopher Morash.
Thanks very much, Una. Before I start, two things to say. I think, from now on, when I think of the word tenacity, I'm going to think of Kate and Una just for getting this conference up off the ground and running. And the fact that we're even here today is a testimony to a certain tenacity. And Eileen, thank you very much for that call out at the end. That means a lot. You were the pioneer. If somebody had said to me, 10 years ago even, that I would be one of two keynotes at a conference on Teresa Deavy talking about In the Cellar of My Friend, I would have been skeptical. This is a play that was only really first produced by the Mint in 2017. It was one of the manuscripts that was in that famous green suitcase under the bed in Landscape in Waterford. And it was only published in the Teresa Deavy Reclaimed volume in 2017 as well. So that first production was one of a bill that Jonathan Bank did in the Mint Theatre in 2017. Production called The Suitcase Under the Bed, which included Holiday House, Strange Birth, The King of Spain's Daughter, and In the Cellar of My Friend. So at one level, for much of its existence, the play constituted a kind of dark matter of the canon of Irish theatre. Now, I'm going to return to this concept of dark matter in a different context toward the end of my talk, but it comes from the theatre theorist Andrew Sofer. And basically, what he refers to as dark matter in theatre is what appears when we do what we might call a spectral reading. It's a kind of phenomenology of the unseen. And in some ways, I think perhaps what I'm doing complements what Anne Shanahan was doing, in the sense if she was talking about the material side of Deavy's theatre, I'm going to be talking about the other side of it. Now, before we plunge into this phenomenology of the unseen, I think it's probably worth just saying a few words about In the Cellar of My Friend itself, in terms of placing it in the narrative of Deavy's career. Now, at this point, because of all the work that people have done over the years, that narrative is quite well established. That Deavy's career really falls into kind of two phases. There's the Abbey period, and then there's the kind of post-Abbey period. So the Abbey plays are, they begin with Reapers, they go through A Disciple in 1931, Temporal Powers, and then King of Spain's Daughter in 1935, Katie Roach in 1936, Wild Goose Lodge, 1936 again. And there's that kind of astonishing burst of creativity during which she's really one of the Abbey's most prolific playwrights. However, one of the things that's worth remembering about that period as well is that her plays were also being produced on radio in the late 1930s. And King of Spain's Daughter, in fact, is produced on television in its very brief pre-World War II phase. So there's a production of King of Spain's Daughter that was done by the BBC on February 25th, 1939, that was produced by Dennis Johnson and featured Phyllis Ryan and Breffney O'Rourke. And it makes it among the very first of the television dramas anywhere in the world. So I'm sort of reluctant to break Deavy's career into a stage phase and a radio phase, because she was already doing work for radio while she was having work produced on the stage. Now, that break that happens, I think, really comes when the Abbey stops doing her work. And in Deavy studies, this is something I know a lot of scholars have focused on. There's that really painful letter to Florence Hackett, probably from 1941, where she talks about Ernest Blythe's letter returning a play. Blythe's letter, when returning it, clearly showed that he has no use for my work, never asked to see any more. It may be a good thing to be finished with the Abbey, yet I love the Abbey, and their actors are fine. Now, it's not actually clear from that letter what play she's referring to. It could have been Holiday House, or it might have been Wife to James Whelan. But that phrase, never asked to see any more, has a kind of chilling finality to it, particularly with so little explanation. I think the other thing that's probably worth remembering is that there were two major theatres, at least in Dublin at the time, well, two really, the Gate and the Abbey. And she also sent Wife to James Whelan to the gate, only to have it returned as well. And there's another letter to Florence Hackett where she writes to Florence Hackett on December 17th, 1948, and she says, they say at present they don't have a suitable cast. Alas, alas, I don't know when it will get produced. So as we go through then this second period, we have Light Falling, the play that Anne mentioned, produced in the Peacock by Rhea Mooney in 1948. And we have that 1956 production of Wife to James Whelan, which is done in Madame Cogley's Studio Theatre in 1956. One of those, Madame Cogley's Studio Theatres, one of those kind of small Irish studio theatres that the work of people like Ian Walsh have alerted us to and made us really reassess. What's most interesting, though, I think, about this post-Abbey period is that Deavy continues to work and she continues to innovate. And her letters certainly show that she wanted to get her plays staged. But as the years go on, the possibilities for staging become fewer and fewer. So it's not quite that she's writing a theatre of the mind, but it's something like that. And In the Cellar of My Friend belongs to that period. Now, like so many of the manuscript materials in the Deavy archive, the surviving scripts for In the Cellar of My Friend are notoriously difficult to date precisely. Deavy had a very unhelpful habit of dating letters with the month and the day, but not the year. And the manuscripts of the plays are almost all undated. So one of the few clues we have about In the Cellar of My Friend comes from a letter to the critic John Jordan, who published really one of the most complete contemporary accounts of Deavy's work in the University Review in 1956, and with whom she corresponded in the late autumn of 1955, when she was sending copies of her plays to him via Andrew Flynn, who seems to have acted as a kind of agent for her at the time and ran Progress Publishers. So there's a letter from November 13th, 1955, that she sent from her Dublin address at the time. At that point, she was living in the garden flat on 20 Clyde Road, to Jordan, who actually lived not too far away at 18 View Avenue in Harold's Cross. And she writes to Jordan, she says, "I am awfully pleased that you're doing this article on my work." But then she goes on to say that she'd try to find him a script of Alma's Glory, although it's a play I've never had a very high opinion of. And then she goes on to say, about In the Cellar of My Friend, "I'd like you to do just whatever seems best to you." Now, that doesn't tell us a lot about the play, other than that it had been written at that point, but perhaps also that she considered it more interesting than a play like Alma's Glory, which in fact had been staged. So at the same time, she's writing to Jordan to ask would he want to write about a play that had neither been published nor performed. He didn't actually, but she seems to think it's important for him to read it. And she also is enthusiastic about the way in which Jordan reads her work. So when the article appears, she writes to him and says, "You have labored, you have dug, and have brought up once more many of my deepest thoughts and feelings, that, from lying lonely far down, were almost dead." So I want to focus on this play, In the Cellar of My Friend. Now, like many of Teresa Deavy's short plays, In the Cellar of My Friend appears deceptively simple, almost kind of hopelessly naive. The world of the play seems to be a sleepy little world inside a realist box set. And I think one of the things Anne Shanahan did, I think so powerfully, was give us a sense of how the realist box set is something that Deavy both works within and subverts in some ways. Here's this description of the set for In the Cellar of My Friend. It's a room in a house in the Irish countryside, Grant's Thorn House. And here's how she describes it. "The room is a pleasant one, not large, but suggestive of space and of leisure. At the back, centre, a full-length window stands open, revealing part of a big garden, flowered now with sunshine. It is a July morning, about 9:30, and through the window can be sensed some of the loveliness of the morning." Now, we're clearly in Deavy land here, which is so often signaled by precisely this sort of suffused sunlight. The very intensity of that sunlight almost making us want to mistrust the textures of the material world that we're looking at, even as we're sinking into them. Think of the opening of Wife to James Whelan, and its opening on that sun-soaked bench behind the garage that they call the South of France. Or recall that letter to Florence Hackett written after the opening night of The King of Spain's Daughter, when she declared, "The whole play has turned for me on the atmosphere of an April day." And she subsequently dedicated the play, when it was published, to an April day. I always thought one of the things that Jonathan Bank brought out so well in his Mint productions of Teresa Deevy, simply by staying meticulously close to the script, was the look of the plays. Deevy's theatrical world is one in which everything looks just a little bit too perfect, where the lighting key is just a few notches higher than it should be, where the blossoms on the cherry tree outside the window are just that little bit too profuse. And in the same way, many of the characters seem almost too at home and untroubled in those perfect worlds. Think of Tom and Bill sunning themselves in the South of France in Wife to James Whelan, Jim Harris reporting with satisfaction on the offstage wedding at the opening of The King of Spain's Daughter. It's all paradoxically too simple and too much. In The Cellar of My Friends, very much in this mode. The play opens with the character Belle Dobbin dropping into Granthorne House, where her friend Patty Dean and their family live. And just in case you missed the point about the play not simply being, the setting not simply being mimetic or a naturalistic backdrop, Patty compliments her on her dress, telling her, "You look like a summer morning." To which Belle replies, "Well, isn't it summer? And a lovely morning? The most lovely. See this basket? Nothing really but a platform for the roses to rest on, and the great handle arching over them like a rainbow. No sides, nothing to hold them, but they hold on." Now, there's a couple of things here that are characteristic of Deevy's aesthetic. The first is that sense of what she calls in the letter to Florence Hackett about The King of Spain's Daughter, the atmosphere that is due, at least in part, to a certain quality of light. Now, that's something, of course, she explores explicitly in a late play, 1948's Light Falling. In that play, the character Mr. Leslie, who's a painter, and this is something I think Emily Bloom explored so well in her paper. Mr. Leslie says, "For me, truth is embodied in light falling. If I can get that down on canvas, others will see in it, the eternal mystery, the beneficence. Oh, damn it all, there's nothing new." Now, I think this passage in The Cellar of My Friend, this opening passage, "Isn't it summer?" and the discussion of the morning, the loveliness of the morning, captures, I think, something that is there in Light Falling as well. This sense that there is some kind of eternal mystery, to use Mr. Leslie's phrase, that is immanent in the phenomenological world, that is in the light itself. And it's in a way both wondrous and banal. It's in a basket of roses bathed in sunlight on a summer's morning. Now, I want to read that passage to you again, but I'm going to do something sort of unusual. I'm going to read the punctuation. "Well, isn't it summer, dash, and a lovely morning, dot, 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 the most lovely, dash, breaks off, dot, dot, dot. See this basket, dash, nothing really but a platform for the roses to rest on, dot, 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 and the great handle arching over them like a rainbow, dot, dot, dot. No sides, nothing to hold them, dot, 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 but they hold on." 45 words long, and the passage I've just read contains no fewer than 5 ellipses and 2 long em dashes, or on average about 1 irregular break in the syntax about every 6.5 words. Now, that may sound like a strange way to read a passage, but to me, I think it's central to the way in which Deevy's theatre language works. Now, this aspect of her language first became apparent to me at one point in 2010, when Jonathan Bank was preparing Wife to James Whelan for production. And Jonathan was working on the manuscript that's now in the Maynooth archive, and he was concerned about typographical errors in the manuscript. And what followed was what's probably one of the nerdiest email correspondences in the history of Irish theatre history, in that we both noticed that Davy used a lot of ellipses, but they were of varying lengths. They ranged from the standard 3 dot to a 5 dot to a 7, and there was one super ellipsis of 11 dots. Now, being of a speculative turn of mind, I liked the idea that Davy was actually scoring her play as you would score a piece of music. And I came up with a theory that a standard of ellipsis of 3 dots meant a pause of 3 beats, 1, 2, 3, and that a 5 dotter meant basically a 5-beat pause, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and an 11 dotter was effectively like a kind of tableau. Now, fortunately, Jonathan, being much more practical and being a director who didn't want to just direct by numbers, was having none of it, and he stuck to the view that Davy, or her typist, had a typewriter in which the full stop had a habit of sticking, so that any attempt to produce 3 dots in succession could produce anything from 3 to 11. And Jonathan had on his side a recollection by Jack Davy in which he claimed that she, quote, worked away on a battered old typewriter that no one else could work. It was so old and out of date. So the question remains unresolved. But the fact that Jonathan and I could actually have that conversation in the first place should tell us something about the significance of broken syntax in Davy's work. Now, I'm not saying that either one of us was emphatically right, but Davy certainly uses ellipses more than most playwrights, and she uses them with unusual precision and unusual frequency. And in fact, it might really, when you start to look at this, it might remind us more of a writer like Harold Pinter, and the famous Pinter pause, than it would of many of Davy's contemporaries who were writing for the Abbey at the time. In Davy's case, there's plays, and In the Cellar of My Friend is one of them, in which it can be rare for a character to manage more than full sentences, two full sentences in succession without breaking off into fragments. So I think there's a number of ways we can think about this. I think from the perspective of thinking about Davy as a deaf artist, there's clearly something to consider here in relation to her use of ellipses. For where the speech stops, there is, if not silence, then at least the momentary cessation of the spoken word. And I think you could argue that it's in those silences that the plays do their work. But what makes In the Cellar of My Friend so interesting is that the whole play is like this passage in a number of different levels. That while it appears that we're looking at a theatrical world that's basking in its own fullness and completeness, the play is as splintered as the speech. Now let's have a little look at it a bit more closely. In the first instance, objects in the play have a habit of breaking into fragments. So when Belle looks at the basket full of roses, she looks at it first and sees the basket full of roses, and then the basket effectively disappears in her perception, becoming, quote, nothing really but a platform for the roses to rest on. No sides to hold, nothing to hold them. Becomes, well, in phenomenological terms, a tool, an object whose sole purpose is to accomplish a task, and then it erases itself as an object. At the same time, the roses become more fully present as roses, and she sees them as having a kind of intensity of presence, almost a kind of immanence. And then they too kind of cease to be pure objects, become available as symbols. So that when the character of Tom, Patty's brother, pricks his fingers on them, he immediately veers away from the actual rose to an unspoken idea. Ah, those roses are treacherous. I often think it. Hidden thorns always in them. And that's, by the way, just for the record, a line with 14 words, 3 ellipses, and 1 em dash. He goes on to ask Belle what she once said to him about the red roses. What did you say about them? Drops of the precious blood. You told me, scarcely heeded, yet making for gladness. And Belle replies, did I say that? Then I was cribbing, not my own words at all, but Barney's. Now, we can also think of the plot of In the Cellar of My Friend as being like one of Davy's sentences, where what looks like an ordinary innocuous sentence is broken up. And the real significance of what is happening is in the pieces that are missing, in the silences. Now, the character of Barney, who's mentioned here, is the play's fourth character, Tom's son, hence Patty's nephew, and a young man of about 21. We first hear of him when Tom enters raging about Barney's latest idea, so absurd, preposterous. And that's the point at which Belle cuts her finger on the rose, startled because she believes, as does Patty, and indeed the audience, that Barney's latest idea is to propose marriage to Belle. So far, the play is very much like what we expect it to be. A drawing room flooded with summer sunlight in which the female lead and the male lead are going to end up married. And this is what Belle and the audience think is happening right up until the play's final scene, when we discover that Barney's great epiphany the night before was not that he should ask Belle to marry him, it's that he should join a religious order, live in a monastery, and commit his life to God. In fact, it's not until the play's final moments that Tom actually states with full explicitness what's happening, that Barney is leaving Granthorne to, quote, become a monk. And the effect of this is to leave the audience with the sense that they've been distracted by some other play and have somehow missed the real play that was taking place in front of their eyes. And of course, when you think about it, that's precisely the same effect that's produced by the ending of the earlier plays, The King of Spain's Daughter, or Katie Roach, where Annie Kinsella, or Katie Roach's decisions at the play's end, seem to have been made while we were all looking the other way. Or to put it another way, it's as if the words in the sentences suddenly appear like irrelevances, and the real meaning lies in the silence between the ellipses. Now, underlying this reading of In the Cellar of My Friend is the idea that there's a kind of dramatic syntax to Deavy's theatre that's extremely precise and actually extends to all elements of her dramatic construction, but is nonetheless belied by the distinctive way in which her characters sometimes seem to drift through the plays in an almost casual way. Going back to In the Cellar of My Friend, when Barney first appears, he's described as follows in Deavy's characteristically discursive stage directions. Barney appears at the window, coming quickly and lightly. He's 25, wears a dark suit and a shirt open at the neck. Seems somehow distraught, and yet at the same time exultant and charged with eagerness. Now again, this might not seem like a remarkable set of stage directions, but the word that catches my eye here is exultant. If we go back to The King of Spain's Daughter, the exact same word, and it's a strange word, is used at the play's end, when Annie Harris has decided, inexplicably really from the audience's perspective, and indeed from that of the other characters, to marry Jim Harris, after hearing that Jim has been busily saving his shillings week by week. Having seen his meager savings book, she says, "He put by 2 shillings for 200 weeks. I think that he's a man that, supposing he was jealous, might cut your throat." And the stage directions at that point describe her as quiet, exultant. Now, Deavy confided to the theatre director, Matthew O'Mahony, in an unpublished letter in the National Library that the play is a comedy, or she thought of it as a comedy, because Anne marries Jim, quite reconciled at last, as she has found passion in his persistent affection, and so can visualize herself as the heroine of a possible tragedy. Being romantic, she wrote to another correspondent, Annie likes to picture herself in danger. Now, this idea that the play is a comedy for this reason is interesting, and Deavy's using the term in a very particular way, in the sense of playing a game of presence and absence, of hiding things in plain sight. And I think that's also what she's exploring in The Cellar of My Friend. The audience of The King of Spain's Daughter think they're watching a play about a woman choosing between a factory and marriage, but Annie Kinsella thinks she's in a play called The King of Spain's Daughter. And it's that switching of worlds that produces the comedy, if you like, as Deavy uses that term. Now, what helps make the case that the use of the word exultant in these stage directions in 2 plays is not accidental is the observation that exactly the same word appears in the stage directions in the closing lines of Katie Roach. And here we have, Katie at the very end of the play, and where she's described as exultantly looking out the window, saying, "I will be brave. I was looking for something great to do. Sure, now I have it. I think that there's a kind of precision here then that extends not just to Devi's use of punctuation, but to her stage directions. And I think that word exultant is not simply a case of a writer having a favorite word, but I think she uses it to signal a particular state of mind. All of these moments in which characters are described as being exultant, whether it's in The King of Spain's Daughter, in The Cellar of My Friend, or in Katie Roach, occur at a moment of renunciation, where a character has given things up. There's a letter in 1939 about an unidentified play that Devi refers to as Port of Refuge, is the draft of it. And she's writing to Florence Hackett. She says, tell me what you think of Port of Refuge. I like the way it brought out the disillusionment that follows on getting what we have put too much store in having. And I think as a kind of working schema, we have one of the coordinates of Devi's theatrical world here. That which can be possessed can only produce disappointment, whereas when we renounce possession, the result is a kind of exaltation. However, the nature of that renunciation, and here it seems to me is the really interesting paradox in Devi's theatre, is that it's not a renunciation of the material phenomenological world. In fact, it involves an immersion in that world. Much as The King of Spain's Daughter can be said to be a play about renunciation, it's also a play in which Devi can say, the whole play has turned for me on an April day atmosphere. And that's what makes In the Cellar of My Friend such a pivotal play for me, because we find that same complex dynamic at work, but with the gender roles reversed. Where King of Spain's Daughter, Katie Roach, and wife to James Whelan are all now quite rightly studied and respected as plays about women's experience in Ireland in the mid-20th century. In the Cellar of My Friend, that central elusive role, the Annie Kinsella role, the Katie Roach role, the Nan Bowers role, the role of the character who renounces the world and experiences exaltation, is actually occupied by a male character, Barney Keane. Now, this doesn't suggest, I don't think, that gender is irrelevant to those earlier characters. It's not. I think we can say that the gender of those earlier characters, their place in Ireland in the 1930s, a place that was defined by that Irish Constitution in 1937, puts them in a position in which Devi can use them to explore both that gender role, but also to explore something else, which Barney Keane perhaps suggests is not purely gender specific. So that's why I want to focus on In the Cellar of My Friend, because it's the odd one out. It might help us to think about Barney Keane as a kind of development of those earlier characters by reminding ourselves that he's not the first one of Teresa Devi's protagonists to have imagined his future in terms of a religious order. There's a curious line in Katie Roach where that strange character Reuben asks Katie if she loves Stanislaus. Do you care for this man? He asks her. And she replies, I do indeed. Wouldn't yourself if he wanted to marry you? And then she goes on to say, I didn't know that was love till he asked me now. And I said to myself, there's your convent. In other words, I think for Katie, marrying Stanislav involves the same kind of renunciation and the same exaltation as entering a convent. And that line comes in the middle of a passage that I think helps us understand what's going on in The Cellar of My Friend. The passage opens with the entrance of that character Reuben, who in performance is a really menacing, dangerous character. In fact, in performance, he not only disrupts the fictional world of the play, he also disrupts Katie Roach's dramatic form, grating against its surface realism, like a character's wandered in from some dark fairy tale. He's about as close as Devi ever comes to creating a character as less an individual, I think, and more an embodiment of an idea. So when he first enters, and Stanislaus says innocuously enough, good evening, Reuben replies, it is a fine evening. It is one of these golden evenings that God still lavishes on a sinful world. Now, That might just seem like the kind of line you'd use to establish him as a kind of puritanical old curmudgeon, and it does that. But let's remind ourselves of the importance of atmosphere. That's that word Davy uses in the letter to Florence Hackett. The April day in King of Spain's Daughter, the sunny day in Wife to James Whelan, the summer sun in the beginning of The Cellar, My Friend. Golden evenings are not something that Davy takes lightly. I think that the moments of exaltation in Davy's plays have a kind of religious referent, and it's a very specific kind of religious referent. In the scene from Katie Roach that opens with Reuben referring to the golden evening that God still lavishes on a sinful world, he goes on to state his own theological position quite unambiguously. This is what Reuben says. Christ left no doubt. He was at war with this world, worldly thoughts and worldly values. And Reuben, as a kind of wandering holy man, as he's described, embodies the kind of theological view that the material phenomenological world is inherently sinful and fallen, and hence to be rejected in every way possible. Katie takes a different view. You couldn't go very much by the Bible, she says. What's said in one place is unsaid in another, and that's the great puzzle. Often you think you had an answer. Now, in performance, this can be like seem like one of these moments when Katie is simply being vague, and she is vague a lot of the time. Seems like it, but I don't think she is. I think there's actually a precision here. And it's it's the case of Davy apparently saying something casual and actually doing something very serious. If Reuben represents a form of Catholicism that is dogmatic and is founded on a dualism, in which the material world is evil, and only that which is not of the world can be good. And it's a strain that ran through Catholic theology, the form of Catholic theology that was influential in Ireland in the early decades of the state. If Reuben represents that, then for Katie, and I think for others of Davy's characters, goodness, or indeed God, can be immanent in the world. It can be immanent in light falling, as for Kenneth Leslie in Light Falling, or in April Morning. But here's the important thing. Katie gets it precisely. That immanence can never really be known. It can only be experienced. It remains a great puzzle. Now, what I'm moving toward here is the possibly deeply unfashionable idea that Teresa Davy's theatrical aesthetic has at least a kinship with a very particular form of Catholic mysticism. Now, it's one of the most difficult things to get a focus on, I think, in Irish culture of the middle decades of the 20th century is the experience of Catholicism. And I mean, there are very good reasons for that because of the social effects that the Catholic Church had in Ireland, and we know these well. But there are forms of religious experience that I think we've often excluded from our understanding of the culture of the period, that if we let them in, can actually open up the way in which some of the work from this period appears. And I think in Davy's case, that's particularly true. Now, I'm using the word mysticism here in a very precise way. There's lots of woolly ways of talking about mysticism, but the simplest explanation of mysticism that I would take would come from William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, where he defines mystical religious experience as having four features. One is that it's ineffable, that the mystical experience has what he calls a noetic quality, which is to say it involves a form of knowledge, and it's transient, and it's experienced passively. And I think that's relevant for that renunciation we've been looking at here. So to put it simply, mystical experience is one of transport, of being carried somewhere else. So that makes it inherently theatrical in lots of ways. The incommunicableness, says James, of the transport is the keynote of all mysticism. Now let's take a step back for a moment and just note that there's good reason to put Davy's work in this context. Now, to begin with all of the kind of scant biographical writing we have about Davy, almost all of it mentions her deeply held religious views. Her nephew, Jack Deavy, claimed that she made a pilgrimage to meet Padre Pio, who was, quote, apparently rather rude to her on account of her deafness. We also always have to take some of this testimony about somebody being deeply religious, particularly after they've passed away, with a bit of a grain of salt, particularly in Ireland of the time, because saying somebody was a devout Catholic was really, just a kind of compliment. It was a way of saying they were a good person. But I think there's probably more to it than this. In that article that Martina Ann O'Doherty wrote in the Waterford Archaeological and Historical Journal, she reports that she was told by family members that Deavy was a daily communicant and that she'd been on pilgrimages to Lisieux, to Lourdes, to Fatima, Assisi, San Giovanni, and Rome, and was an active member of the Legion of Mary in Dublin. Now, going beyond that kind of third-person testimony, and there's quite a lot of it, I think we conceived a deep religious conviction in some of Deavy's most unguarded moments. And there's particularly a letter that she wrote to her friend Patricia Lynch just after her sister Nell died in 1954. And it's quite a heartbreaking letter. And it's a response to a letter we don't have from Lynch, where Lynch appears to have described thinking about Nell as still being around her fireside. And I think of this as the fireside letter. The way I think of this letter, it's kind of a pivotal one. Deavy writes back, "It is just what I feel too. And I love to know that Nell is in your fireside group. The great fire we gather at is the glowing heart of God, pulsating with love." And then she ends that with an ellipsis. "I do feel that Nell is, quote, living her life somewhere else." I think, that phrase, the great fire we gather at is the glowing heart of God. I mean, there to me is somebody for whom a particularly mystical form of religious experience is absolutely central. Now, in the late work, this appears more and more. That late radio play, Supreme Dominion, is about the 17th century French priest, Father Luc Wadding, who was the founder of the Irish College in Rome. And when she was rewriting the play for radio, she wrote to a radio producer. She said, "I think of Luke always as very spiritual. This is hard to convey." And in a later letter, she develops the thought, "About Luke Wadding himself, my idea when writing was to reveal him more by the reactions of others to his personality than by any wonderful sayings or doings of his. This makes your job on air very hard." So there's a sense in which if Luke Wadding had the same kind of religious convictions as Reuben, for instance, he'd have no trouble proclaiming them from the rooftops, just telling people to renounce the sinful world. But his religious experience is a different one. It's an inner one. It's not one that can be projected outwards. And then, of course, there's the very late, very strange play, One Look and What It Led To, which was broadcast posthumously on Radio Air in 1964. And the play opens in the time of Christ, features Jesus and his disciples, and focuses on Mary Magdalene. And it goes to a very strange scene in what seems to be contemporary France, in which either very old or immortal Mary Magdalene is still living in a mountainside as the bride of Christ, speaking to him through the birds. "Of late, we've had so many interruptions," she says. "In the beginning, you, uppercase Y for you, spoiled me. Those lovely years when no one came, only the birds. You, my beloved." And in addressing Christ here as the beloved, we've got a connection to In the Cellar of My Friend. Because In the Cellar of My Friend, the title of In the Cellar of My Friend, comes from the spiritual canticle of the Spanish saint and mystic, St. John of the Cross. "In the inner cellar of my beloved have I drunk. Over all the plain I knew nothing, and lost the flock I followed, and when I went forth before." The beloved there is Christ. Now, St. John of the Cross had a profound influence on a certain brand of Catholic mysticism, and particularly in the middle of the 20th century. He's particularly influential on St. Teresa of Lisieux, and Lisieux is one of the sites of pilgrimage that Deavy is reported to have visited. It was written when its author, known as St. John of the Cross, Carmelite monk, who was a disciple of St. Teresa of Avila, was in prison for heresy in a cell barely large enough to hold him. And it's about suffering and about spiritual revelation through suffering and renunciation. And I mean, it's a remarkable work with probably no real equivalent in English literature, in which the soul ultimately enters into a kind of full communion with Christ. And he writes his own analysis of the canticle later on after it was released, and he says that God can infuse love without specific knowledge of the thing loved. Now, in the cellar of my friend, that image of cellar suggests a place of confinement, which obviously connects it with things like the setting of King of Spain's daughter. But it also suggests the wine cellar, and hence drunkenness, and the need to go beyond rational proof. And when Barney tries to describe the revelation that he's had, the thing that makes him decide to become a monk, he turns to the words of St. John of the Cross. Here's what he says. Last night, something happened. I was invited, and the stage directions say slow, looking for words to describe the experience, to come nearer. Not for the first time, but always before I'd drawn back, dreading. Last night, being happy, I went forth. In spirit, I mean. I opened the door, or it was opened for me. Something was offered. How foolish is all our dreading, and then exultant is the stage direction. Our withdrawals, hesitations, how utterly foolish. Last night, something happened. What? Neither the characters nor the audience ever really know. And this, to me, is what makes the play so fascinating. Perhaps, more fascinating than the more straightforward, if that's the word, religious world of One Look and what it led to. In the Cellar of My Friend is not just about mystical revelation. It's about how easy it is to miss or to misread the signs of this revelation in the world around us. And in this sense, I think that In the Cellar of My Friend is a comedy in the same sense that in King of Spain's Daughter is. The entire play hinges around an unseen off-stage moment the night before that we never come to terms with. We never get to know what it is. And when Barney attempts to write down this revelation in a letter, drawing on spiritual canticles of St. John of the Cross, all that remains of his revelation are some broken bits of misunderstood sentences. And just in case we missed the point, Davy underlines it for us, because it's a literal case of the dog ate my epiphany, because he writes it down in a letter and the dog chews it up. Barney's response is, maybe it doesn't make one bit of difference. Maybe the puppy had some wisdom. And that chewed letter, I think, is the visual equivalent of this fractured syntax of Davy's own writing that I started off by exploring, with its use of ellipses and its use of long dashes. And all that his father, Tom, can make out, as he and Belle pore over the letter, is the word explanation, which is kind of ironic. The only word they can make out is explanation. There's no explanation, followed by some puppy chew. And the phrase, and coming forth, knew nothing of all this, plain and lost. Seems to me, says Tom, that when a man's drinking, he can't be judged by ordinary standards, completely misreading the whole idea of the cellar, thinking that it refers to actually wine. But if we go through the play, this kind of misrecognition of the religious imagery of the play suddenly appears in a different light. I mean, at one point, Belle asks Barney a simple question. Why have you done this? And Barney replies, you, quoting her question, uppercase H. And her, in this case, is the angel of the Lord from Judges 2, who asks why the covenant of the Lord has been broken. And indeed, we can go right back to the moment earlier in the play when Tom recalls Belle once calling the poppies in the cornfield drops of the precious blood, you told me, scarcely heeded, yet making for gladness. Now, Belle quickly disclaims the image as her own, saying it came from somebody else. It did come from somebody else. It came from Saint Therese of Lisieux, the Catholic mystic known as the Little Flower, who was much influenced by St. John of the Cross. So we can go back to that moment when Belle reflects on the roses in her basket. Roses may just be roses. They're part of the phenomenological world. They may be symbols of romantic love, but they are also part of that symbolic tradition in the Catholic mystical tradition. And they recur in stories associated with the Virgin Mary and a whole range of female saints, ranging from St. Elizabeth of Hungary to St. Rita of Cassica. all of which involve roses miraculously appearing in baskets of food. Now, let me try and tie all this together then. There's a passage in Teresa Deavy's unpublished correspondence that I keep coming back to as a kind of telltale snapshot, a moment that opens up, I think, a glimpse of her life as a writer. And it comes from a letter to Larry McDonough, the radio producer for Radio Éireann. It's dated the 11th of November, 1947. And it's at a time when she's trying to convince McDonough to produce Wife to James Whelan. And she asks if she can get a pass to the studio to watch the radio broadcast of Lennox Robinson's play Ever the Twain. And as Emily mentioned in her paper, what Deavy would do is go into the Radio Éireann studio and lip read, watch the actors reading the play. She says, I wonder if I might have a pass for Thursday night's repeat of Ever the Twain. This is the play I would like to watch. If Mr. Ojeda does not mind, because you told us before, come any time. We called up on Sunday night only to hear the lift man could not take us up when there was no pass. And I think that image of her kind of standing behind the glass, watching the play, that sort of distance that she would have experienced from radio, to me, I think suggests something about her aesthetic and the way that it operates. That there are privacies in her work that we cannot fully access. And I think in that way, she's some ways closer to, the work of, say, Brian Friel in Philadelphia, Here I Come, where he finds a theatrical device of dividing the character of Gar into public and private, one of whom gives us access to that internal privacy, that subjective privacy, and the other of whom is inarticulate and speaks in the kind of broken sentences we find in Deavy. But I think when we start to factor in the role that a certain kind of mystical consciousness, and again, I use that word of the kind of precision, plays in her work, I think what we start to see is a kind of triangulation. Now, I don't want to suggest that we can explain Deavy's work simply as a deaf artist in a world of the hearing, and that results in a certain heightened consciousness of language, although I think that is a distinctive and powerful part of her work. And I don't think we can explain her simply as a woman in a society that offered women very limited roles, even though that is certainly there and is a very powerful part of her plays and of her work. And it's an important part of the way we understand her. Nor am I suggesting we can simply understand her as a Catholic mystic. What I'm interested in is how those three things converge, triangulate, if you like, to tell us something about her theatrical aesthetic. And I think it hinges around this idea of what I'm calling dark matter. Now, this is a phrase I get from the critic Andrew Sofer, where he describes dark matter as the invisible dimension of theatre that escapes visual detection, even though its effects are felt everywhere in performance. He goes on to say, if theatre necessarily traffics in corporeal stuff, bodies, fluids, gases, objects, it also incorporates the incorporeal, offstage spaces in action, absent characters, the narrated past, hallucination, blindness, obscenity, godhead, and so on. This is no less than physical actors and objects. Such invisible presences matter very much indeed. And even if spectators, characters, and performers cannot put their hands on them. I think in Deavy's work, language is part of that visual world, that world, that material world. And hence, language itself is a problematic thing. In The Cellar of My Friends, very early on, there's a character says, very seldom are messages properly given. And there's a line toward the end where the character of the gardener, Martin, it's a bit like the old retainer furs in Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, says, it do seem to me there is no two people can fully comprehend one another. Not fully, not as I sees it. I think almost all theatre makes some use of the paradox of dark matter in its production. But what I think Teresa Deavy's theatre does is also makes it its subject matter. I think this becomes more self-conscious with the later plays, the plays that I'm calling the kind of theatre of the mind. because she's working with a medium that is in some ways fundamentally visual. She's thinking about it in terms of radio, but she's also, I think, thinking about the ways in which theatre deals with the things we cannot see, the ineffable. I think in Devi's theatre, that visual world is both as fully present as sunshine on a July day and as elusive. And likewise, language, when we begin to listen closely to it, is full of gaps and elisions, the chewed bit of a letter that the dog got its teeth into. And it's thus a theatre that I think stages the comedy of a world in which the possibility of meaning can only be glimpsed through the silences. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Christopher, thank you so much.
Thanks.
I never thought I'd say this to you, but you had me at ... But when you said the dog ate my epiphany,
Yeah,
I moved into a kind of celestial space.
afraid I couldn't resist that one.
I thought Kate and I were the only ones who had telephone conversations about DV's punctuation.
Nope. There's a whole nerdy world of us out there.
Yeah. I think it comes along with transcribing plays, and you in that act of transcribing and editing, you become so alert to the other character in the DV play, which is the punctuation. Yeah. So I drifted away there for a moment. But dragging me back is the chat and some lovely comments. And we'll start off with a question from our friend and colleague, Sean Richards. He's asking you, Chris, the point about the light in DV being almost too bright, the flowers too profuse. If these are in her stage directions, is she drawing attention to the artificiality of what is staged as realism, and to what end? And I think that, that question connects nicely in with Anne's talk as presentation as well, but you might think about that for us, Chris.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, actually. And, I be careful what I say about stage realism around Sean, because he's written quite a lot about this. But I think that's right. I think that her plays they look like realism, and I think it's very easy to read them as realism. But just from what we know of her, just even her engagement with the Abbey, she's not fully happy with the kind of aesthetic that's there. So I think it's a case of working within the bounds of what's possible, but yet subverting it. And I do think that, and I think, as I say, one of the things that really brought it home to me was looking at Jonathan Banks' productions in the Mint, where Jonathan just he really lit those plays brightly. Yeah. And it even comes across in the video versions, and everything is just a bit too vivid, and you're looking at a realist world, but at the same time it's just a bit too intense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this might link into a statement really that's coming from Ben Quinlan, talking about mysticism and thanking you for bringing that back in. And I suppose, you mentioned a couple of times you're using, you're talking about mysticism in a very precise and specific way. And I suppose, given the fact that you're writing and thinking about Yeats now, can you talk about that? Can you bring that together?
The last 5 minutes.
Can you bring those two things together? Can you throw a light on Teresa Deavy's mysticism from your reading and thinking about Yeats, which you've been doing recently?
And I feel like you've kind of got into my head somehow. I spent the last year and a half writing about Yeats, and one of the things you have to, with Yeats, take seriously that he takes seriously the existence of the supernatural.
Yeah.
I just finished teaching a module with my students on this, and you know, by the end of it, I think, you know, they were probably all out, you know, getting ready to attend seances. But you have, there's a kind of, you have to, you don't have to, you know, sign up to it yourself, you know, but at the same time, you have to take seriously that, you know, in order to understand Yeats's theater, you have to understand that you have to accept that he thinks, you know, that there is a spirit world that is present, and that his theater is a way of producing that experience. And I think with Devi, I think because of the history of Catholicism in Ireland and the Catholic Church's involvement in the social side of society, you know, and we're all very, you know, critical of the church, and for a lot of good reasons. It's hard to take religious experience seriously. It's hard to actually talk about it. In fact, as I was doing this talk, I was thinking, I shouldn't have worn a polo neck. I look a bit priest-like here talking about religious mysticism. And I would treat Catholic mysticism the same way I would treat, you know, Yeats's belief in dreaming back and Swedenborg. You know, that it's there as something you have to accept as a valid experience for the writer, and that the writer is trying to produce that experience in the theatrical event. It doesn't mean I have to subscribe to it or anyone else does, but it is nonetheless it is a valid thing.
And just to say, because we know from Devi's library that David Clark gave us a glimpse into what the library was. We know that she had Yeats's 4 Plays for Dancers within her own collection, a beautiful copy, so we know that the connection to Yeats is there. We know that she's interested in that kind of theatre that moves away from realism.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because you've just picked up a subliminal thing in what I've been doing that I didn't even pick up. I had completely put Yeats and Devi in 2 different boxes in my head when I was doing this, but I think that's exactly where this is coming from, is, you know, dealing with a writer for whom, in order to come to terms with what he's doing on stage and how his theatrical aesthetic works, you have to credit a metaphysic of some kind, or you have to kind of bracket it. You have to accept it as a possibility.
Yeah, and I suppose you have to embrace it without your own prejudice of what that might be, and allow that, because of course, I think we don't know what Devi's own experience of spirituality was. And what's really telling is that she doesn't write about it too much.
No.
It's very private.
Yeah.
And what really struck me was when you spoke about that privacy, trying to find my own notes, which I've got all over the place. These invisible presence, language as a problematic thing, the struggle to say the unsayable, to communicate the incommunicable, which is so beautiful in Devi's work and so touching. And I think of what Anne said about being moved to these profound emotions. It seems to me that this is the way Devi moves us.
Yeah. I think the other thing which I kind of stayed away from is it allows us to think of her in terms of modernism as well.
Yeah, I think so.
If we're thinking about, you know, modernism in terms of if you like, the inadequacy of language and breakdown communication, and particularly theatrical modernism, and I think that's where I would say that the realism is almost like it's in quotation marks, that it's there on the stage, but it's flagged as being inadequate.
And we teach Devi in the modern. We have a modern drama module, and that's where Devi, you know, she lives in many modules. But it's the more that students teach us about her in those seminars, the more I feel convinced that's a right home for her work. Emily Bloom saying, loving all the attention that Cellar of My Friend is receiving. Kate and I also echo that. We mentioned it to Anne as a play that was confusing us and we wanted to know more about. And it's just, this conference brought us so many joys, and today is the culmination of those many joys. I'll see if I've got any more questions down here. Fascinating talk. Thank you so much. Wonderful lecture. Really lovely comments. Question, what did you think of the recent of Katie Roach in the Abbey? The use of an altar doubling up as the central table. What, I mean, any reflection?
Yeah, I think
reduction?
Yeah, no, I think I was going to actually bring that in. I just thought, no, just leave that to one side for a moment. Yeah, I think that was a really interesting production, because what they managed to do was show us that the plays are not bound by the conventions of stage realism. That you can, that the dynamic of the play is not produced by that box set. That you can actually break it out of that. So the way in which that production used theatrical space in symbolic ways, in ways that meant things, the way in which the stages, you have the white stage covered with this dirt, and then, making the kind of paths through that dirt, and the way in which the set kind of closed in on the main character of Katie. I think that what it did was it found another way, a different kind of theatrical language, to produce that kind of spatial dynamic that Anne talked about so well. I mean, the way in which the space of these plays is part of what they're about. In a way that Devi signals to us with King of Spain's Daughter. For those you might miss the point, here's a sign that says "road closed." That it's. But she does that in her own scripts, within the language of theatrical realism. But there are other theatrical languages of space that can accomplish the same thing, but in a very different way.
Yeah.
I loved it. I thought it was a great production.
Yeah, I love the production. I think, I love Caroline Byrne. I love Kathy Leaney's conference presentation, talking about it. I'm loving everything at the minute. But alas, we will have to go home for some of us, or turn off the computer and be at home for the rest of us. It remains only now for me to thank everybody, to thank our keynote speakers again, to thank everyone who has supported the conference, and Kate and Hugh and I in so many different ways. And I want to thank everybody here today for engaging with all the different conference events online. As I sat here and listened to the keynote speakers, I wanted to go back and listen and engage with the conference presentations again and think about them again. It was our plan to archive the website at the end of today, really, but I think we'd be very happy to leave the conference website up for another week. If anybody, would like to go back and look at those presentations again, you're really welcome to do that. Please get in touch with us if you've any other questions. If we have questions in the chat that we haven't answered, we'll get back to you directly with those. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you.